Valerie, and thank you very much indeed for the invitation to present on behalf of myself and Will Brady. So this evening, I'm working to the heading of regional planning in Cork, and what I hope to do is to raise a few issues and to present a few planning concepts which might enliven or contribute to your own discussions about the future of this region over the next couple of decades. I don't really want to spend too much time reiterating what's in the statutory regional plans, national planning framework and documents like that. I'm sure people are very familiar with those already. But as I said, what I'd like to do is to help you, align you a little bit towards some of the planning thinking behind what it means to do regional planning or regional or spatial planning, as we also call it. So we know that, for example, in Ireland, we have some formal regional planning. We have formal regions. In fact, we have since the early part of the 2000s, we've had regions of various kinds. They've been enlarged and modified for various reasons over the last couple of decades. But as we know, regional government is not a very strong tier of government in this country. But regional development and regional funding, especially encouraged by the European Union, is a feature of public life in Ireland, although it doesn't have a very strong democratic connection with people in the regions. So now we're in a situation of having 3 super regions, I guess you'd call them, and the official regional planning effort is carried out at that level. And the Southern Regional Assembly area, as you see, is quite a large one. Yeah, so we're not just talking about the formal regional planning that goes on, but a lot of the planning story in Ireland is actually based around informal planning initiatives, rather than the ones that are set out in statute or required by legislation. And I guess it's one of the things that makes Cork quite distinctive is that we in Cork, or our ancestors in Cork, have taken the issue of land use planning and spatial planning very, very seriously throughout the 20th century. It's an interesting, it would be an interesting exercise to dip into some of the early plans for the city and the sub-region. And going back to the 1920s, the Cork Civic Survey of 1926 is an interesting one. And for those of you interested in issues like flooding, protection of city centres, and identification of locations for growth, would do well to look at the Cork Civic Survey of 1926, because not much really has changed in terms of some of the big environmental issues that face us right now. And then subsequently in 1941, there was a well-known town planning report by Manning Robertson, which introduced us to the concept of the green belt and land use planning for suburbs and areas a bit further out from the city centre itself. So, this tradition has been there for some time. And then that was brought on to quite a big jump forward in the 1970s, the late 1970s, when the City Council and the County Council together commissioned the Land Use and Transportation Study, the LUTS. In 1978, it was a very important milestone in planning in Ireland because it was a voluntary collaboration of 2 adjoining local authorities who decided to see how the sub-region, the overall sub-region would work over and beyond their limited boundaries of their own authorities. And so the extent that it was voluntary probably influences on how successful it was. And those of you who might have had a chance to study the Land Use and Transportation Study, the LUTS, and its update in 1992, will see that many of the ideas in this strategy were implemented, and they're still quite influential even to today. And one of the things about regional planning that distinguishes it from let's say, master planning or city planning is that the regional or spatial scale, the planning maps tend to be blobs and dots and strange looking polygons indicating strategic directions of growth rather than very detailed land use planning specifications. But yeah, so most of the main headline achievements of the LUTs are very interesting to look at, especially in terms of transportation and the provision of transportation infrastructure and land use, the locations of land use development. The areas in which the LUTs plan didn't perhaps succeed as it might have done were primarily around the public transportation side, and also the very clear social justice challenge for trying to get a balanced city. Growth and development and opportunities and wealth really isn't very well spatially distributed in Cork. And there's still a disparity between some neighbourhoods of the city and others in terms of access to employment, education, and other things. So that social objective is not one that moved on to a great extent, although there has been some progress. In the early part of this century then, in 2002, the two authorities, as well as other major stakeholders, including the harbour authorities, the universities, the construction industry, and businesses, came together as major stakeholders in this new spatial plan, the Cork Area Strategic Plan from 2002. I was lucky enough to be on the steering group for that project. And this moved along and brought the LUTs ideas into the 21st century. And that again was quite an influential plan. The CASP itself was updated in 2008, and then it's been quite persuasive in a lot of ways, which we'll mention. The reason why I bring up LUTs and CASP is because these were voluntary initiatives by Cork, actors in the Cork scene. There was no direction from national government that you have to prepare sub-regional plans. Sub-regional planning was attempted in other parts of the country, but it wasn't effective in the same way as it was in Cork. The Cork Area Strategic Plan, for example, in its emphasis on trying to develop along the rail corridor, along the north and eastern part of the city, resulted in the government unlocking funds to reopen railway stations along the eastern corridor particularly. And that would only have been possible through a strategic or spatial regional plan of this kind. And that wouldn't have been possible through the normal legal statutory planning processes. So I just want to emphasize the importance of these voluntary arrangements between authorities and other major actors. And as we know, as we've come on to see, this kind of strategic planning at the sub-regional level is now statutory, it's on a statutory footing. And it remains to be seen whether it's just as effective when it's not voluntary, when it's something that you're required to do because government has said you have to do it. So out of CASP in particular, we came across this concept of Metropolitan Cork. So the study area for LUTs and in the Cork Area Strategic Plan was based around a drive time. I think originally it was a 40-minute drive time. And that was the study area. And it included the ring towns of Bandon, Kinsale, Macroom, Fermoy, Mallow and Youghal. But then out of this study of LUTs and CASP came out of this idea of the metropolitan area, that effective spatial unit that operates like a metropolitan city. And that concept of Metropolitan Cork was mapped for the first time in CASP, and it's now become part of the national planning scene to the extent that the national government has identified metropolitan areas spatial plans for all of Ireland's cities, but it was initiated in Cork. So for those of you who remember arriving in Kent Station and seeing the sign "Welcome to Cork" and saying what the population is, it was something like 115,000. That didn't change very much throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s, because most of the growth in Cork, the effective drivers of Cork City, were outside the city boundary. And Cork behaved as a metropolitan city beyond the boundary of the Cork Corporation area, way back since the 1970s. And it was quite interesting that when people reported the success of Cork, they tended to report the population of the city centre, neglecting to report on how the planned growth of the satellite towns, such as Carrigaline, Ballincollig, Glanmire and Cove, had developed as part of a network working with the city centre, and all of them working together to function as a metropolitan city. And so the starting point for all of the strategic planning at spatial or sub-regional scale was, of course, its natural environment. So the receiving environment, the River Lee catchment, the river basin, and the coastal zone itself, and the historic centre from medieval times, and how it grew really up to fill up the city council or the Cork Corporation boundary almost completely. So that footprint was built out fairly quickly, and to the extent that when the city council needed to do some expansion in the 1980s and 1990s, all that was really left to develop was the Mahon Peninsula. And so we found that some land uses like offices and some large scale retail found itself in the Mahon Peninsula, where it really would have belonged in the city centre or in the centres of the towns surrounding the city. But that was an effect of the constrained boundary of the city council. But as we know, there was contiguous growth on the north and south of the city council boundary. So the effective footprint of the city and its suburbs was larger than the corporation area. Growing up the southern hills and the hills on the north side as well, and along the basin. But then this network of other settlements, which were separated from the city centre footprint and the suburban footprint, this necklace, let's call them, of satellite towns were part of the strategic planning. And the idea that these satellite towns, many of which were small villages really in the 1970s, have now grown to become significant towns in their own right. And somewhere like Ballincollig has been, the planned growth of somewhere like Ballincollig now is quite significant. Whilst it doesn't have its own council, it never did. It's larger in scale in terms of numbers of population and employment than many county towns like Ennis or Letterkenny or other places around the country. But this is planned growth in a particular way. And the idea is that each of these settlements grow independently of the city centre, but connected to it. And that each of these settlements would be based on a jobs-led growth and not just simple sprawl. And the way in which these places developed their own identity, and not just as suburbs of the city, was that there was a strong greenbelt urban containment tool in place to make sure that didn't happen. And so this story developed into something quite coherent. And to the extent that we've been able to or encourage the next stage of growth to shift towards the north and east a little bit more than it had been, so that we could sort of try and find a way of encouraging rail-based growth and a shift towards public transportation. It's been very, very popular for many decades for developers and landowners who are interested in development to focus on the greenfield lands on the south and southwest. And that's why we saw quite a distorted or an unbalanced level of growth between the northeast and the southwest. So the reopening of the railway line, encouraged or facilitated by the CASP, was a major shift in strategic planning thinking. And to the degree which is successful is open to debate, but it certainly had some effect. But it's not just identifying towns for growth for jobs and for populations. It also required very specifically identified locations for industry and employment. But not any kind of employment. So there was locations like Ringaskiddy were identified for heavy industry. Now Pharmachem, Little Island and places like that were identified for logistical employment. The city centre obviously for retail and office-based employment and others. And then of course we saw a bit of a drift in terms of employment to locations that were challenging in planning terms. So for example, the amount of city centre type uses that have occurred at the airport has created certain kind of issues as well. But again, a part of this story of the sub-regional plan for Cork included this proposal for a new town on the railway line between Cork City and Blarney. So the reopening of the Blarney railway station, opening a railway station at Monard, and the creation of a whole new town there is part of this package of development to rebalance growth from the southwest to the north, and also, of course, to regenerate the city centre, including the docklands and the brownfield sites that are there, and developing places like Middleton and Carrigtwohill in particular around the reopening of the railway stations. So I just want to come back to this idea of spatial planning being long-term projects. So if Lutz started as presenting these ideas in the 1970s, they still have currency today, many decades later. And so that brings us to the importance of strong spatial metaphors, which Will has written about in his academic papers and others. And at this scale, this idea of the spatial metaphor is quite important. So the idea that these can endure, that people can buy into the idea very easily, and that they're clear and easy to explain. And they carry some authority, even though they're not necessarily legally established. And one of the most famous ones of these is the plan from the 1940s for Copenhagen, which is known as the finger plan. The idea that the city would grow up around the fjord, but future growth would be along these fingers, these public transportation fingers over time. And again, this is a kind of voluntary plan. It doesn't have any statutory meaning, but for many, many decades, the finger plan has found its way into operation. So people could buy into it, communities could buy into it, public transportation providers, developers and others would buy into the idea. And it's a very, very strong spatial metaphor. Even now, when Copenhagen is connected by bridge to a southern part of Sweden, you can see that the finger plan is a very strong, enduring spatial planning instrument. And in a way, I suppose what we're talking about is that this city centre and suburbs surrounded by a network of satellite towns and strategic employment locations, all connected by the strategic landscapes-based urban containment greenbelt, really is what the spatial metaphor for the Cork sub-region has been for some time. And that makes things, brings us into our current time. So what are the headline planning ideas from the Lutz and CASP? Well, it's developing metropolitan Cork as a city of scale and quality, that it's not just simply a small regional city, because when you behave like a metropolitan city, like it does, it's no longer that small 100,000 population, in European terms, relatively small city. It's now a significant city, a mid-sized European city of 250,000. That it encourages transportation choice, a shift from exclusively car-based development to other forms of public transportation. It links development to population, to jobs, and to rail-based development, to try and achieve a balanced population pattern, as we've said before, in the social justice side of things. That hasn't quite been achieved yet, and that we work with employment-led growth rather than simple sprawl. And that delivery would happen in an integrated way. And so the question is, so this is a voluntary set of spatial planning ideas. Can this be delivered through statutory planning work? And that's where the challenges arise in many respects. So I guess when we start looking at how do we deliver this as planning authorities and as other stakeholders, it really behoves us to wear two hats in a way, or to look at things at two different scales at the same time. The planning instruments that we look at, so for example, there's a document known as Cork 2050, which was jointly prepared by the city and the county as a submission to the national government when it was preparing the national planning framework. So these are now in place. We also have a statutory metropolitan area strategic plan, which is a child of the national planning framework, and all of the metropolitan cities in Ireland have them. But again, these are things that have been imposed by government. They're required to produce them, and they don't yet, let's say, have captured the imagination in the same way as Lutz and CASP would have done. And then subsequent to that, we're familiar, I think engineers in the region will be particularly familiar with the metropolitan transport strategy that was developed on foot of many of these different initiatives. And now, of course, we're seeing a review of the city development plan and a review of the county development plan. And all of these in a way are coming together. So it would appear as if our planning instruments from the national to the regional to the city level and the neighborhood local area plan level are all very nicely nested with each other like Russian dolls. So they fit in with each other and it's quite rational and sensible. And some people would say the planning system is like jigsaws fitting together. And we like that, don't we? That's where things to be rational and sensible and fairly comprehensive and joined up. Joined up thinking is something that people are always looking for. So, you know, we can see this neat coming together of all these different ideas. I suppose, though, we probably need to be aware that, whilst things on the surface look as if they're very well integrated, so spatially between the national level, regional level, and metropolitan area, and then in our instruments, our county, local area, and master planning levels, but also our different sectors, so investment programs, budgets for different government departments, different projects that are being brought forward, whether transportation, education, or health projects, that they can all come together, the public sector and the private sector and the community sector all coming together, that in a way it all seems to be very neat and working nicely one with the other. But of course, whilst we think in very instrumentalist ways, integrated thinking, being rational, everything being consistent and comprehensive and having a complete picture of everything, we know from our experience, of course, that really that's not always how it works. When you look at actual places, actual populations, investment in jobs, or how households develop and so on, and you come to things like zoning land and so on, we find that things start to unravel a little bit. And what seems to be very neat gets actually quite jumbled up. And so in this real world of politics, of power dynamics, of confusion, of uncertainty, and all those kind of things, we really get a setting or an arena to do planning, which is kind of broken up and fragmented. Yes, it's flexible for sure, but it's also quite political. It's complex. It's not linear. Things don't develop in the order that we expect them to. So this is the challenge that we're faced with. And we're all very familiar with the challenge of sustainable development, about balancing the needs of society with the economy and the environment. But I'd like to just throw in one little idea here that let's say when we bring the planning lens to this balance, we also need to dive a little bit deeper into these different concepts. So the economy isn't just about GDP, which we could measure in GDP, but it's also about actual good, high quality livelihoods for people. The environment isn't just about air quality, water quality, and so on, and protection of nature. It's also got to do with places that are creative, that are resilient, that are dynamic, and where people can live flourishing lives as well. And then when it comes to society as well, of course, we need to be aware that whilst we're doing very well on some indicators, on others we're not. So homelessness, access to housing, access to education, and so on, is not balanced across our sub-region. We need to be very aware of that in particular. And our planning school in particular, which whilst many of the teachers on the course and in the program have a background in built environment, many of them come from the social sciences as well. And it's an interesting coming together of different traditions, the humanities as well as the sciences. So when you have a spatial plan at a regional level, how do we know when it works or not? So, it's not like a project where you have a start point, a budget, a phasing, a completion date, and a handover of a project. When is the end date of a plan? When does it finish? And especially when we get to the level of the sub-region or the region, the performance, it's not like a blueprint that you can just say, did we or did we not deliver on it? Have the things we said we would build, were they built? There are other ways of measuring performance. And so we probably need to take a reasonable view on when is a plan effective and when isn't it? And this particularly influential planning writer called Andreas Fludi says, really its purpose is to give guidance and to try and help chart through the uncertainty and conflict that goes on around spatial development. So really, when you're assessing whether a plan has been successful or not, it's not about what was built or not built. It's really about how did that plan or that instrument influence decision-making? Was it decisive? Was it influential? Was it authoritative when a decision was being made? And that gives us a different set of expectations, and they're really quite interesting. So, for example, when people make decisions, the decision makers really need to know the plan. That it's not a plan just owned by the planners or the engineers or people who devise the plan, but also must be bought into and owned by the decision makers, who could be politicians, investors, or others. So what Fludi calls the community of discourse. There has to be a community of of participants who own the plan. And then when decisions are being made, the plan must actually be invoked. So if you, for example, see some decisions with it which fit in with the plan, that they're accidentally aligned with the plan, that's not really particularly a good outcome. The plan must be invoked. We need to call on it very, very explicitly for it to be an effective one. So decisions must conform to the plan in a deliberate way. They can't be coincidental. An effective plan is one that's invoked, even if it's invoked to undermine it, to go against it. So, for example, non-conforming decisions should also be deliberate. So if there's going to be a discussion about departing from the plan, for some reason, there might be political realities which say we need to depart from the spatial plan for one reason or the other. The discussion about departing from the plan must be influenced by the plan itself. That it can then said to be influential, even if the decision makers depart from it. And that's quite a subtle difference, which would be worth being aware of. And also because if the plan then itself, because of the way it's written and brought together, that it can trigger its own review. When does it now need to be looked at again? That we don't simply review it every time a new crisis arises, but that it should have this regenerative capacity based on its philosophy and layout. Again, a couple of quick things about plans. So we're very familiar with things like zoning maps, master plans, and things like that. But then at the regional scale or the spatial scale, we tend to be looking at blobs and dots on maps and things like that. And I just want to mention maps just a little bit as well. And it's one of these little tricks, I guess, when you think about it. Here in our planning school, we have a map of Metropolitan Cork. But it's a detailed map on a large scale. And this is one of the things, it's really just a trick for us to remember that whilst on our phones and on our devices, as we zoom into maps and we see more and more detail, we see in less and less of the context. And similarly, when we zoom out on our maps, on our phones and our devices, we begin to see, we lose detail. So we have context with no detail, or we have detail and with no context. And that's like two different brains. So there's something to be said for having a large map of the full context with the detail in it. So we almost have to work at the two levels. We have to have our two brains working at the same time. So there's something to be said for, yes, let's look at the role of somewhere like Cove and how it fits into the spatial layout of the sub-region. But what does that mean for the actual zoning? How do we deal with the historic core? How do we deal with energy transmission? How do we deal with development on the hillsides and perhaps affecting the landscape? And how do we deal with potential land use conflicts, say, for example, in the harbour around the incinerator or the reopening of Spike Island for leisure, or the number of Seveso sites in the harbour, which could potentially be conflicting ones. So as I said, we have to, yes, look at the spatial scale, but at the local scale as well, in some kind of fashion. And then, if we begin to talk about places like Monard, the proposed new town in the northwest, that we can see where it fits in with the overall balanced spatial strategy for the place. That we don't just see it as a bunch of fields which we have to find drainage for, or an access onto the national road, or how do we build a railway station. It's really got to this, we really have to conceive of its role in terms of trying to rebalance the city. Because really, the north side communities in Cork City have very few areas to grow currently, in many respects. So when we're looking at somewhere like the city, the city centre itself, we're in the city looking out, but we can be on the edge of the city looking in. And we can see that patterns of development can be seen in some cases to be quite consistent with the plan. So we've got the green belt is quite strong in most places, and we could say that has been rather effective. And for engineers who are tasked with the job of trying to retrofit infrastructure, water and storage and other forms of infrastructure to locations that really aren't amenable to them, then of course the engineering problem can be solved, but the environmental or planning problem might not be. This is where the alignment of priorities needs to happen. So again, we can see that in reality, there are many ways in which the spatial planning has worked. And if we were to assess where we go from now, then we need to think about the compact city, both in terms of what we need to do within the city itself, but also what we need to do. So I'm talking about the historic core, for example, reusing old buildings, working with brownfield sites and so on, and how we address the suburbs. I mean, we know that the suburbs are low density in Cork. There's lots of open space for sure, but not very usable open space. There's lots of paving, lots of roads, lots of footpaths, many cul-de-sacs, not very well aligned with each other, not very permeable, and not very efficient use of land. So one of the challenges for sub-regional planning in the coming decades will be to see how we can retrofit the suburbs to be more efficiently used, and to create and make places that are more resilient than they currently are. And then, the handful of key strategic projects. So reintegrating this, this is, I mean, the reorientation of the railway station to the city centre, for example, and the work that's going on around that, the reuse of land and bringing office-based development and residential and significant numbers of homes into the city centre in these projects is quite a significant development. So we often see them as, these things have come on site, that the cranes are on the skyline for the last couple of years, but these have arisen at the end of a very long change of strategic planning decisions, so you can see this kind of work was anticipated in the LUTs and in the CASP and so on, and the next phase of development we know is when the port starts to move downstream, and then it releases the Tivoli docks for the next stage of serious urban regeneration on the national road network, on the suburban rail network, with good cycling of access to the city. We can see how this can happen. Again, these are the kind of flagship ideas that would fit in with these long-term spatial planning ideas. And again, it's a bit disappointing in a way that places like Monard have fallen off the agenda. And we hope that it'll come back onto the agenda again, because it's so easy to continue to develop low-density housing estates on the edge of Carrigaline and Ballincollig and Douglas and places like that, where builders love to build. It's harder to make a big decision to create a new place and a new town. So, I don't know if those of you who haven't seen the master plan for Monard, it's worth having a look at. This is a strategic development zone passed through on board Penala. Yes, there are infrastructural difficulties, but its layout and design is based around sustainable transportation, appropriate densities, development of neighborhoods rather than simply housing estates, and employment-led on the national rail network. And again, this very deliberate refocus on the city centre, the premium targets of trying to achieve significant amount of new development beyond brownfield sites. We're beginning to see some significant development in the north and south docks, and then of course moving eastwards along the river towards Tivoli and so on. So, but what we need to be careful of, this is a good planning story. A lot of good work is coming and being aligned together at present. We need to be careful that those other decisions that are happening elsewhere don't undermine these. And that's a point that we'll come back to just when I finish, because we can see that the city has developed up to the ring roads and so on. But as we jump across the South Link Road, for example, and we see industry, light industry, business parks and things like that, we begin to notice that the edge of the city is a kind of a messy place to some extent. We know that roads attract building. Strategic roads are built for the purpose of getting goods and people from A to B, but they also attract property development. And that relationship really hasn't been broken very strongly. So we can see unusual employment development in locations that are not accessible by public transport. And then we can even see, for example, that housing development has straddled this kind of brown development, the light industry, the warehousing, the logistics and so on. And then we find housing estates being bolted on the end. And there's still interest in people who own land and are interested in developing land around here to kind of somehow how to bolt on more housing estates onto these locations, none of which really are aligned with proper sustainable development principles. And the extent to which, say, for example, business parks around the airport have developed. You know, these are significant employment locations, remote from the city centre. And no matter what we say about COVID and so on, we know that the city centres are going to make a comeback. And things like the science park, you know, which is a significant amount of office-based development if it's fully built out, will have an impact on the city centre, no matter how much green technology is used in developing the individual buildings and so on. So we need to keep an eye on the influence of individual pet or vanity projects on the entire subregion in the long run. And again, just to remind you, like if unplanned sprawl is something we need to take out of our lexicon, we need to be very careful that we don't have unintentional planned sprawl. And that can happen. You know, if we, in the public authorities and in civil society generally, if we give in to the demands of people who want to build on land that's easily built on the edge of the city, we can see that on the edge of the southern part of the city and on the northern part of the city, we can see a lot of demand still for building on these greenfield edge of city locations. And this is where the city councils and the county councils and other authorities really have to dig their heels in, because on one side, we can't really talk about sustainable transportation solutions, the 15-minute city, integrated neighborhoods. We can't use that terminology on the one hand, and the other, you know, give serious consideration to low density planning permissions on the edge of the city, on the north and on the south. And there's real evidence of it. So whilst we're trying to develop Monard as a new town, there's also severe pressure to rezone agricultural land on the edge of the city, which don't have any of the facilities that somewhere like Monard might have in the long run. So that's something we need to keep an eye on. And again, just to finish on this bit, we probably need to look again at the harbour as well. So we know that the harbour, the port is going to move downstream. We know that there are a lot of really serious drivers of growth and development for the sub-region in and around the harbour. And we know that changes are going to happen in the future. We know that in Ringaskiddy, we've got many Cerveso sites. We've got the pharmachem industry is based there, but also there's a community living there. There is Spike, so the Spike has reopened. Hall Bolin now has a beautiful park and so on. But the need for an incinerator hasn't gone away. And we are going to find conflicting land uses if we're not careful. So, you know, to say yes to all the good projects and cuddly projects and popular ones, you know, may preclude us from making wise decisions later on, for example, around how we deal with industry and the needs of industry and those kind of industries that are subject to Cerveso and other constraints. I often wonder, for example, why in the middle of Ringaskiddy, in this big heavy industrial location, why we find a third level education institute there. It occurred to me that most third level students, whatever subject they're studying, whether it's forestry or medicine or nautical and the marine, that they really should be in the city centre. And because universities and colleges are the drivers of town centres and city centres. You know, why do they need to be in the middle of an industrial location? Why do things like that need to happen? And if you look at the harbour as well, on the eastern side of the harbour, look at Whitegate and Ahada, the power station, the oil refinery. These are going to have a limited lifespan. With climate change and changing priorities around the place. What's the future of Whitegate and Ahada? Yeah, they're coloured blue because they're industrial. So what are their futures going to be? What's the next phase of employment-led development, and what might that be? What should these locations be reserved for, so that they can continue to play a strategic role in the long run, the same way as Ringaskiddy did? And just coming to an end, and I apologize if I'm running over. Underneath all of this, then we have this story about the changed boundary of Cork City. So Cork City, the old corporation area, has now been expanded. And And yeah, I mean, it brought to the end, the expansion of the boundary had brought to an end a long period of uncertainty. People didn't know how local government in Cork was going to work. We in the Centre of Planning Education Research, particularly advocacy work done by Will and others, tried to make strong spatial planning arguments for a metropolitan authority, so that the metropolitan area would have its own metropolitan area authority. We weren't advocating for a merger of the city and the county. We were looking for the idea of a metropolitan authority. In the end, what we have is something that's neither one nor the other, but at least we have a decision. We now have two planning authorities, housing authorities, transportation authorities, sanitary authorities, roads authorities, and they know their boundaries and so on. But all of the spatial planning sub-regional work that I've been speaking about, it doesn't recognize that boundary. But the real politics starts to come into play. And how do, really in the very long run, the citizens of Metropolitan Cork aren't going to ask us, well, how did Cork Corporation behave, or how did Cork County Council behave? That's not really the issue. When you're thinking like when the planning authorities are behaving like landowners looking after their own individual interests, that's understandable, but you wonder whether it's ideal in the long run. So it's kind of curious that Ringaskiddy, Carrigaline, Little Island, and some of those significant locations are not part of the city. And one of the ones that I find quite tricky is that Monard, this proposed new town on the northwest, seems to have been strategically omitted from the boundary of the city. So, when the city is talking about trying to rebalance its population, it can't do it within its boundary. It's depending on the county council to bring forward Monard. And is the county council going to bring forward Monard as the new town when it's under pressure from landowners and others to continue developing along the southern periphery? So these are the kind of challenges that are going to play out. Even though we have our strong spatial metaphor, the delivery is a little bit like the unscrambled Rubik cube. And if we think about all our different projects, our statutory and non-statutory pieces of work, like the Metropolitan Area's transportation strategy and others, I just want to get this point across on behalf of Will in particular, is that we shouldn't see all of these plans and projects and ideas as a menu, like a buffet. That we're going to have some of these roads, and we'll have some of this development of greenfield development, and we'll have some brownfield development, and some bike lanes, and maybe a light rail, that we choose things from a buffet or a menu, then that's problematic. Like Will's arguments, many times we've heard, is that we should look at it more like a recipe. So you choose the appropriate things at the right time, the right amounts of the various things, and you make them happen in the right order. So whilst the Cork Metropolitan, the CMATS study is a really interesting one, some super ideas in there, the phasing of it suggests that we may find that it's going to result in road building for some time to come. Whilst what the spatial planning imperative may be that the road building should be backloaded if we're going to have some, and some of this is sometimes unintentional. So yes, having a long wish list of things is great, but it's not a buffet. It's a recipe, and this idea is kind of a strong one. So we have to be able to make choices, and we have to make brave decisions. Good spatial planning allows us to say no when something is not good, but wholeheartedly to say yes when it is good. And that's why spatial planning at this regional spatial level will make it work. So whatever our metaphors are, we're taking national cake and we're having slices of it. The national growth targets, slices of it is given to Cork, and we have to make do with it. There's nothing to say that we have to limit ourselves to what the national cake gives us. Or if we're talking about apple pie and saying, we want everything and mom and apple pie, no one's going to argue against it, then we're kind of in trouble. So please help me with my metaphors. They're not ideal, but hopefully they'll have got across some of the concepts that we think might be useful. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Brendan, very, very interesting lecture. You know, and it's great to see, and I suppose get yourself and Will's viewpoint on planning in the area from, you know, a kind of an independent third party. I suppose my colleagues in Cork County Council, and presumably similarly in the City Council, might be more constrained on what they can say. So it's always good to get you know, independent and you know, feedback on where the region might go. So folks, as Val had put up, had said earlier and put up on the chat function, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen where you can ask questions, and I can see some of them coming in there. So I might go through a few of them there with you, Brendan. The first one, a little bit vague, is just environmental planning question mark. It was from earlier in the lecture, so I don't know, was it in reference to a specific point you were making, Brendan? But I suppose as a general point, how do we go about integrating, you know, our climate action goals and that into our spatial planning? You know, obviously in things like CMATs and that, you have you know, targets around you know, transportation, public transportation, etc. But I suppose on a broader scale, how do you as a planner look at that?
Yeah, so yeah, environmental planning is a crucial plank of everything that we do. I suppose if I could just maybe be a little bit provocative about that to some extent, what I would be trying to argue against is the idea that we focus our effort on environmental technologies. You know, if we choose to develop something in a greenfield location, we can retrofit all sorts of environmental technologies to make the thing sustainable within its own footprint. So we can generate our energy, we can have you know, carbon neutral building technologies and materials and so on. The people can drive to this facility using electric cars and so on. But the very fact that it's in a location that's not easily accessible by public transportation can undo all of the other technologies that we've put embedded into the individual project. So yeah, I think what we need to do is we need the people concerned with environmental issues to look at the spatial distribution, like where things are going and where they're not going. And that means that sometimes you have to say no to certain things and yes to other things. And again, this is where I would make an appeal a little bit for the green belt. Like the green belt, well, I would see it as a planner, I would see it as an urban containment tool to prevent sprawl. But it also means that there's a green lung immediately available to communities and others nearby. So like I think we should be looking at active, environmentally managed ways of using the green belt. It's interesting to see the city council, for example, having a very strong set of themes in its city development plan, its draft city development plan around green and blue infrastructure. It wouldn't have been possible to have such a comprehensive set of green and blue infrastructure policies in the draft development plan if we didn't have a spatial layout defined by the green belt. You know, so the receiving environment is already of high quality. So we can move on with environmental planning policies there, in my view.
Okay, that's good. Actually, that kind of answers somewhat of a follow-up question that I was going to ask you about the fact of the extension of the city boundary and whether the green belt was possibly at risk. But I think from what you've said there, the city council intend to continue to have it as an integral part of their development plan.
Well, yes. Having said that, they don't use the word green belt, which I think is quite interesting. I think they're using a word like city hinterland. And in the county council area, what they would have previously called is strategic metropolitan greenbelt areas, something like that. These were the areas that they were trying to hope that places like Blarney and Tower don't merge in with each other, and that Glanmire doesn't merge in with Mayfield, and that you have a bit of green lung, and that somewhere like Bishopstown doesn't become, or Ballincollig doesn't become a suburb of Bishopstown, that kind of idea, or Douglas and Carrigaline don't join up. So that's been there, but I think the language is being watered down a little bit, which is a slight worry for me, because if you call the Greenbelt city hinterland, then it means there's nothing to say that, you know, in the next development plan, that city hinterland won't be smaller and smaller and smaller, you know. So that's just a personal view about the Green. I'm a bit of a traditionalist when it comes to things like that.
That's fair enough. So I suppose just moving on there, next question was, what are some of the recent planning decisions which you expect to have strong benefits for Cork City, Cork City's near future development, including the harbour? Are there any kind of highlights that you would pick out?
Yeah, well, I'm particularly excited by the what's happening in the Docklands, the North and South Docklands. I think now there are a lot of uncertainties about it. Like, for example, for all the permissions that are happening in the Dockland areas, it's great to see brownfield development being reused. It's nearly all offices though. And look, whilst offices are important, they're not the only employer. And I think we need to see a bigger proportion of homes as part of the developments in the Docklands, the North and South Docks. So yeah, very tall buildings that are hotels or office buildings, fine, but what about homes? So that to me is a little bit of a worry, but I'm quite excited about what's happening in those locations. So Horgan's Quay, for example, which the next phase should really have apartments involved and relatively high density housing, and that's quite encouraging. I would be slightly worried about how the proportions of social and affordable housing in some of these locations as well. But housing is housing. So those kind of things are encouraging. It's interesting to see development occurring around rail stations, or even if not existing rail stations, potential ones. Brady has written quite a lot about the north side of the city. So we have a problem there in that, you know, socioeconomically the north side of the city isn't as performing as well as other places have been. Some of us had hoped that some developments, such, for example, like the universities and other employers and drivers of the economy, would try to invest on the north side of the river. They tend not to. If you look at the, you know, things like the proposed light rail, which is predominantly to the south and southwest, and of course, you know, that's very encouraging in many respects. But there's a real shift back to the south and southwest. We don't know when that light rail is going to occur, but if building is going to happen along that corridor almost exclusively, what's that going to say for the north side? And that's kind of worrying. But having said that, there's some incredibly vibrant communities on the north side of the river, and Will draws attention to, for example, the corridor that, say, it goes from the Opera House, Christie Ring Bridge through Blackpool Village, the old village, revitalizing that village, and then going to the business park at the north end of Blackpool. There's a potential growth pole there on the north side of the city, which needs to be worked on. And there's some developers who've been taking quite risky decisions to invest in some of those complicated brownfield sites in around the new shopping center and other things in Blackpool. To the extent that some developers actually that contributed money to reopen the railway station at Blackpool on the other end of the tunnel, but that money, I gather, was reimbursed to the authorities because it wasn't realised. So that's an opportunity missed. Imagine if there was a railway station at Blackpool and at Kilbarry and at Monard and at Blarney, how those things might happen, because that infrastructure is already there. You know, we can have rail-based commuting using existing railway lines. And yes, the light rail is great. It'll happen at some point. But why not work with what we have? And those pieces of infrastructure are in parts of the city that need development more than others.
That's a fair comment, and I suppose I've come across that situation where, you know, special contributions have been made as part of planning applications, but that the local authorities haven't had the wherewithal, haven't had the full amount of funds or whatnot to actually realise whatever the particular piece of infrastructure was, and yes, the developer is after a certain amount of time entitled then to reclaim that money, and I guess rightly so. If they're essentially paying or partially paying for a piece of infrastructure, if it isn't developed, you know.
And interestingly, Ronan, as well, I mean, some developers will be quite happy to make that contribution. You know, it's not as if they're being dragged in and forced. You know, they see the benefit of it. You know.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, I mean, the price of a given piece of property, an office building or a house or whatever, is the cost of the land and the building and whatnot. But then when you add in the facilities around it, the price of then goes up, and I mean that's in the developers'
it should work,
interest.
yeah. And you know, I mean, I suppose when you work in the university, you can have some of the luxury of being in an ivory tower, but when you think about the scheme for development contributions, were quite interesting. So people who were developing along the rail corridor, there was a special development contribution introduced by the county council to say that, you know, you're going to get higher density development around the railway station. And as a premium for that reason, you as a developer have to pay a higher contribution towards the reopening of the railway station. And that sort of made sense economically. But if you were thinking spatially in terms of the sub-region, it might make sense to do it the other way around, to say that those developers who insist on building on greenfield land that's not accessible to the station in Carrigaline and Ballincollig, that they pay the development contribution towards the rail corridor, almost like a penalty. You know, so why are the people building in the correct locations being penalised, and the ones? See, and I think there's another question that has come up as well. Is, you know, like somewhere like Monard, because it has its planning permission, like An Bord Pleanála has granted planning permission for it. No developer in Monard is going to have to risk trying to get a planning permission through. It's already in place, and so it's a bit like Adamstown or Clonburris in Dublin, where you can. This is where the development follows the infrastructure. You know, you open the railway station first, and then things arise. You know, but the problem is, you know, if you also keep the other tap open, you know, if you also allow greenfield development land to come on the market in large quantities, then the incentive to tackle the difficult ones is going to disappear. If we turned off the tap of the greenfield sites that are being proposed for zoning, if you turn that tap almost completely off, then the developers are bright enough and clever enough and imaginative enough, and the engineers who advise them are clever enough to be able to bring forward serious schemes. But it's always going to be easier to build on the greenfield. That's what's going to happen. So you can't have it. You can't have everything. You have to say, if you want to say yes to the good stuff, you have to say no to the bad stuff. But again, easy enough to say when you're in the university from a distance.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Actually, I'm going to skip down a question or two, because I think kind of a lead-on question. My colleague Miho Diamond was asking if, in your opinion, and I suppose this references more the greenfield type of site, whether developers should be forced to develop the infrastructure first, rather than, you know, kind of, I know there's obviously a kind of a cash flow issue for them as well, but that basically they should be a certain percentage at least of the infrastructure to put that in before they're allowed to develop, you know, phases of a development. So you don't get the point where they've developed, say, for example, houses, they've sold the houses, but then they haven't necessarily completed the estate or the facilities around the estate.
Yeah, and I think this is where we can be a little bit more creative about how we use master planning. Like, what we tend to see is individual. We tend to see individual projects being bolted one onto the other. So many of us have seen that happen. So whereas if you can master plan things, where all of these things are phased and work together, then they're going to be more. But that means landowners and developers working together, and that needs a new way of thinking in some respect. But something like a strategic development zone, an STZ, can make that happen in many respects, and then the development happens in phases. Like, if you look at somewhere like Middleton and Carrigtwohill, where the railway station's opened, people are saying, well, look, the railway station isn't being used very efficiently. You know, the numbers of people commuting aren't very high. Well, that's that's almost the opposite side of it. So the infrastructure has been provided. Now, it just so happens that the property market took a bit of a dive, and it's been fairly quiet. But once it gets going again, then the locations are already identified. So things are often out of sync. Often when the private sector is in the doldrums, the public sector is quite strong, and vice versa, and they don't match together in a very strong way.
I'll just run quickly through a couple of questions. Well, I suppose the next one actually isn't really so much a question as a comment. I think you had mentioned the possibility that that road building might be a requirement, and just as road building, more cars and a frowny face. So I think that person isn't in favour. Then the next question, maybe somewhat political, shall we say, but they ask, do we have the right governance in place to deliver on these plans, I suppose, in your opinion?
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily governance structures that are the problem. I think it's got to do with political and administrative will. Because like in the old structure of the old Cork Corporation and City Council, the chief planning officers, the chief engineers, the city manager and the county manager in the 1970s, along with the elected members, had the imagination to bring forward these spatial plans without any directions from the government, without any Office of the Planning Regulator, without any national planning framework in place. Cork was able to drive ahead on its own steam. So it's not necessarily to do with the government. Now, government structures can be improved. I mean, there's an argument to say that if you had an elected mayor from Metropolitan Cork with certain devolved powers, then you can achieve other kind of things. But really, it's got to do with these voluntary agreements, and imagination and leadership. You don't necessarily need a reorganization of government to do that. But one of the things that I think is really encouraging, if you look at the City Council and County Council development plan review process that are going on at present, the amount of submissions and observations from community organizations, non-governmental organizations, professional associations, school kids, the language used by civil society is really sophisticated. The debates are very, very high level. And so if that's an indication of what citizens are looking for, then, I think those within the planning authorities, the city and the county council and others who want to try and push on with this kind of leadership idea, there is a constituency in society, which is looking for that. People don't want, it's a very articulate constituency of citizens now who are engaged with a lot of this. And I think that's going to shift the discussion to a large extent. It's not really about doing what the developer wants all of the time. And also to remember that some of the developers have incredibly good ideas, and they're taking risks in good locations. It's the threat of the good example,
Very good. We do have quite a few questions, but I'm just kind of conscious of time, so I might maybe cherry pick maybe one or two more, and we might wrap it up then. Shane O'Donoghue said the creation of the OPR, which I presume is the Office of the Planning Regulator, is a positive move for spatial planning and planning making nationally. What role do you see for the OPR playing in spatial planning and plan making in Cork?
Well, the Office of the Planning Regulator is already playing a role. So the office has only been in place for a couple of years. And this is a critical period for the office in a sense, because this is the first time that a whole family of city plans and county plans throughout the country are going through the process. So this is when the Office of the Planning Regulator is really going to exercise their muscle. The Office of the Planning Regulator has already called in some variations to the statutory plans. Some of those have gone to court. They may go back to court again. So there's a high level game of chicken going on to some extent in that area. And also the submissions from the planning regulator to the city and the county, and all of the counties around Ireland actually, are very rich ones. So we'll see how that plays out. Again, we shouldn't have to depend on the planning regulator to tell us what good planning is. But you know, when the wheels start to fall off, our consistent, comprehensive, rational work, the planning regulator is a helpful check for sure.
Okay, good. Another one there, which I suppose I've vested interest in, so I'm going to cherry pick it, but I suppose, would you have an opinion on, I suppose, the Cork-Limerick motorway in terms of regional spatial planning and our, I suppose, the route optioning for it?
Yeah, again, I don't have a very strong view. I know that politically it would be very difficult to argue against it. There is an argument to say that if we had a really good motorway linking Cork to Limerick, that it could undermine both Cork and Limerick, because you could find people, you know, living in Cork commuting to Limerick, people in Limerick commuting to Cork, and the knock-on effect isn't really going to be known. One of the things I think is kind of interesting is that just as a little parochial thing, I suppose, is that you know, kind of indiscriminate planning permissions for individual houses in the countryside. You know, you could take a view on whether that's good or not good, but some of those decisions are coming home to roost now, because in a way, you know, when somebody is trying to compulsorily purchase one or two houses along the route, and then it becomes a question of human rights and, you know, how the government is intervening with people's private property and so on. You know, this is where the private good and the common good come to clash, and planning is always really is about that. My worry about the Cork-Limerick motorway really is that it could take investment and development opportunities away from places. You know, and it's very uncertain what the long-term effect is going to be. It's a bit like, you know, when, you know, the rail travel between Cork and Dublin became very popular for a while, didn't it? And then it started to peter off when the roads got better, because people could drive faster, you know. So I don't have a strong view on it. I think Brady may well have, and you know, if he sends us his replies there, we can pass them on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I might just take last question there from maybe Kevin Burke. So he said the location of the second new elective hospital for Cork could be significant regeneration potential in terms of demand for housing, ancillary services, etc. And he just asked if yourself and Will had any opinions on it from planning point of view. And Will actually came back and said preferably not the south side of the city, maybe the city centre or Blackpool would be preferable. But my understanding, without any particular knowledge, is that they are looking at areas on the south side of the city, which I presume is not desirable.
Of course they are. So yeah, I mean, I would agree with Will on that. I mean, it's like, since the idea of a science park in the southwest was proposed, on the edge of Ballincollig at Curraheen, you know, the argument for a science park was fairly well presented. A knowledge-based development around the university and research and so on and so on. But because of the scale of it, it's sort of becoming a place that says, well, how are we going to fill it up? And it would be very easy to fill it up with an elective hospital, you know, and things like that. So it's a bit like, where would you put a new university department? Where would you put a hospital? So the city centre hospitals have had a bad press. You know, the Children's Hospital saga in Dublin and all those kind of things. But yeah, I mean, like it or not, the big institutions are going to behave like landowners. But those big institutions have a bigger remit. Their remit is a social purpose to them as well, just simply a profit-making purpose. So yeah, I would agree with Will that, you know, the Docklands, the city centre, and the north side absolutely are where we should be looking at we should be looking at brownfield locations, and those brownfield locations that are easily accessible by public transport, including rail, somewhere near a railway station for sure. Don't forget that places like hospitals or universities or shopping centres, these are not just places for patients and students and shoppers to go to. These are workplaces as well. So you have cleaners, you have shop workers, you have nurses and people who have to get to those places all times of the day or night. If their only work commuting pattern choice is a car or something like that, then we're not serving them well. So we have to be careful how we look at that. Now, if I could just comment on a little,
Sure.
Another point as well is that all of these decisions we make on the outside of the city, whether they're good locations or bad locations, it has a direct knock-on effect on the city centre. And there is a view at the moment that the city centre isn't doing particularly well. For those who see the city centre as not doing particularly well, I would say, don't make a hard and fast call on it yet, because COVID has changed the dynamics temporarily. The city centre is probably healthier than we think it is. That's not to say that there isn't dereliction and other things going ahead. When we're trying to solve problems like dereliction or land use challenges in the city centre, they're tricky ones. Many of those are on the way to being solved, but we don't see the results of them yet. So, for example, a compulsory purchase of a building that's about to fall down on North Main Street, we citizens won't see any result of that until it's gone through the courts. So things are happening there that we don't anticipate. Will did a study recently of the city centre, island and contiguous areas. And we discovered that there's a very vibrant city centre population, non-car owning, highly educated city centre population and highly diverse. And we don't get a flavor of that if we just look at the conditions of the buildings. So but all of these things are very vulnerable to bad decisions about where shopping is going to go, where retailing is going to go, where offices are going to go. So like if workplaces are continuing going to the airport and they're going to Little Island and they're going to greenfield sites on the edge of Carrigtwohill, nowhere near a railway station, that has a direct effect on the city centre. And we shouldn't be naive enough to think that restoring a few buildings in town is going to fix that. We're either serious about the city centre or we're not.
Very good. So look, folks, there are a few more questions, but I'm just conscious of time. So I might draw the evening to a close. So look, I'd like to thank Brendan and Will for presenting on their work. As I've said before, it's great to get a kind of an independent perspective on these things. With a very good attendance tonight, which is a great indication of the interest in the topic, and lots of questions in the Q&A, which again is a representation of the interest in the actual presentation as given. So I personally very much enjoyed it, and I think I might be having chats with you in the future, Brendan, about it. So on behalf of myself, the attendees tonight, the membership, Engineers Ireland Cork region, I'd like to thank you both again for the presentation. And I'll bring the night to a close. So for the attendees, if you'd like to keep an eye on our social media accounts and Twitter and LinkedIn and our website, Engineers Ireland Cork.ie, you can get information about upcoming events and the student and professional competitions that we're running at the moment. So without further ado, good night everybody, and thank you again, Brendan and Will.